Let's get started and we'll just let people wander in. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. You know, over the last month or so, I've had the opportunity to participate in a number of Juneteenth and LGBTQ plus pride events across our county. And each of these events taking on particular characteristics of the individual cities and towns where they happen really affirms the depth of the diversity and culture across Middlesex County. And they foster that inclusivity. And I've seen that particularly over the last month or so in communities where these may have been new events, or certainly an event that they hadn't had in the last 4 years. And so a lot of new people coming. And it speaks to what I really see as the core mission for this office and for this task force, which is to always be conscious of the idea of answering the question of, are we doing something concrete to drive down the number of people in our county who may ever think to themselves, do I belong here? Or am I my authentic self? Am I welcome here? That's what we have to be thinking all the time about. What are the concrete actions we are taking to change that? And you certainly don't have to look very far across the news media to see the stories and the really hateful efforts across the country to undermine rights for so many people. You know, Florida clearly has been leading a targeted agenda against the LGBTQ plus community, and that's been going on for a year. And legislation like the Don't Say Gay and bans on classroom instruction around sexual orientation or gender identity has been the focal point for a very conservative and very aggressive agenda. Criminalizing gender affirming healthcare to transgender minors. I mean, criminalizing healthcare to any minor, never mind this in such a particular area, is just unconscionable. And yet every morning when you pick up the newspaper, there's another story about what they've come up to do. The ACLU across the country is tracking 491 anti-LGBTQ plus bills in the United States. You know, so take that at almost 500 and divide that by 50 states. It's not just happening in one place. There are more than 30 bills across this country right now targeting DEI initiatives at public colleges. And 6 states, as of last month, had signed on to a bill by the governor dismantling or significantly decreasing DEI initiatives, 2 in Florida, 1 in Dakota, each of the Dakotas, 1 in Tennessee, and 1 in Texas. So they are having a ripple effect.
Thank you.
Marion, quick, you're muted.
Okay. People are now wondering, even here in Massachusetts, if you saw the front page story on the Globe, wondering about what the Supreme Court decision is going to mean for K through 12 inclusivity in schools here. You know, Massachusetts has been proudly at the forefront, the first state in the country to recognize same-sex marriage, but there's a lot of work to do here. And I think it is with so many things. We sometimes think that couldn't happen here. And yet we look at the Supreme Court decision around affirmative action, you know, a college right here in our county. We have 21 colleges and universities here in Middlesex County. We have 29 others within 15 miles of the border of this county. And what is that going to mean? And then we've been talking for a long time at this task force about the daily acts of hate and bigotry. And many of these behaviors have been the result of politics, of social unrest, extremism, and radicalization. And I am concerned that these decisions, which seem to make some of these things all right or acceptable, are going to encourage more of that behavior. And I think the impact of these decisions on equitable access for whether it is Black and Brown students to higher education, the erosion of what we thought were protected rights of the LGBTQ plus community, that can really feel overwhelming. And I've been encouraged to see the level of legal advocacy to address what came as a result of these decisions. And I think we have to be very clear in continuing to demand what most people and what this country stands for would be basic human rights. And if we're going to move the needle further towards anti-hate and anti-bias communities, we've got to be doing that. I think one of the things is there's a letter in the newspaper today in response to the story yesterday about Boston Medical Center packing families up and sending them in Ubers to the airport, saying, like, have we lost our minds? Like, how can anybody think that's a humane thing to be doing? And yet it's happening here. So I think we got to be thinking about that. And one of the most important ways to do that is really educating ourselves and empowering communities to do better. Our guests today work tirelessly to advocate for the rights of members of the LGBTQ community. We're going to begin with Gabrielle Hamel, who is the Public Information Manager for GLAAD. And Gabrielle, who uses she, her, and Ella, began working at GLAAD with GLAAD Answers in November of 21. She had previously been heavily involved in youth work and was specifically supporting and advocating for LGBTQ youth in central Massachusetts. She holds a bachelor's degree from Worcester State University, where she studied Spanish, psychology, and ethnic studies. She teaches yoga and meditation and is a Reiki practitioner. She loves wellness, coffee, and art. And we can see that behind you, some beautiful pieces. And, you know, for those of you who aren't really familiar with GLAAD, for over 45 years, GLAAD has a record for advancing progress for members of the LGBTQ+ community and those living with HIV. GLAAD works in New England and nationally to really create a society that is free of discrimination based on gender identity and expression, sexual orientation, or HIV status. So, Gabrielle, I'm happy to have you here this morning. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. Like Marianne said, I'm Gabrielle. I use she series pronouns or ella in Spanish. And I am so happy to be here with you all today. I'm going to share my screen, tell you a little bit more about GLAAD, about my work specifically with GLAAD Answers, about some of the cases we've seen recently in Massachusetts. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you all have. Feel free to, stop me at any time if it has to do with the topic I am speaking about at the moment, or I think we'll have time for questions at the end, whatever works. And I'm going to share my screen, so bear with me for a moment. Okay. Okay, you all should be seeing my screen. It's taking a little while to load, so hopefully it will do what it's supposed to momentarily. Let me see. Okay, it is not wanting to load. Oh, there we go. Okay,
there we go.
We're on track. So GLAAD and GLAAD Answers. GLAAD's mission through strategic litigation, public policy, advocacy, and education, GLBTQ, legal advocates and defenders, which is what GLAAD stands for, works in New England and nationally to create a just society free of discrimination based on gender identity and expression, HIV status, and sexual orientation. And at GLAAD, we are committed to fulfilling this mission with urgency and perseverance. To succeed, we will lead boldly and be guided by the following values, which I did not include, but yeah, so our work is basically supporting the LGBTQ and HIV communities, mostly in New England, although also nationally. We do this mainly through impact litigation, as well as public policy advocacy and change. So GLAAD Answers role, I am the person who is in charge of GLAAD Answers, which is our legal helpline for LGBTQ plus people and people living with HIV who are facing discrimination and looking for legal support. We offer legal information, assistance, and referrals. And I will give you kind of a breakdown of who we hear from, but we hear from around 2,000 people annually. It's been a little less since COVID, but we're pretty rapidly this year kind of bumping up that number back to 2,000. We're past kind of our mid-year goal. We hear from folks via phone calls, emails, online intakes. A lot of the people we hear from are facing discrimination, but a lot of folks we hear from also just kind of because GLAAD is one of the first things that come up when people Google like LGBTQ or LGBTQ help or things like that. We hear from folks with a variety of needs. And something that is pretty unique about GLAAD and compared to other legal and civil rights organizations is that we respond to every single person that we hear from, usually within a handful of days, and connect them with resources in the community, with attorneys if needed, or with attorneys at GLAAD. So in 2022, we had 1,600 intakes. Out of the 1,600, 677 were from New England. As I said, our focus is mainly on the New England states, and 425 of those were from Massachusetts specifically. Which really makes sense because according to a 2020 survey done by LGBTQmap.org, 51% of LGBTQ people living in New England live in Massachusetts. So over half of queer and trans people in New England live in Massachusetts, and over half of the intakes we got that were from New England were from Massachusetts. And LGBTQ people make up approximately 5% of the adult population in Mass. And also just a clarification here. We did have 1,600 intakes, but from all of those people, we do not have everyone's demographic information. It's something that we ask for and try to get and are putting more effort into getting so that we have an understanding of folks that we are hearing from and folks who we're missing and need to do more outreach to make sure that we're able to support them. But these numbers are not full, they don't fully show the full picture of everyone we're hearing from. It's just those who choose to disclose. So language, 425 people self-identified as having English as their first language, 22 self-identified as having Spanish as their first language, 4 Russian, 4 Arabic, 3 Portuguese. We also do ask folks what their second language is, and that information is not here, but based on answers that we've gotten for first and second language, overall, approximately 9% of callers spoke Spanish, which very interestingly, and to like our, something that we were very happy about is that that lines up with the Spanish speaking population percentage in Massachusetts. Race and ethnicity, 322 people reported identifying as white, 32 Latinx, 29 Black, 22 AAPI, and 22 multiracial. But as I said, this does not include all the folks we heard from, just those who chose to identify. And some people will choose to identify like one part of their demographic information and then not others. The top issue areas. So the first one was prison. We heard from 261 people who are incarcerated. Another way that I did not mention that we hear from folks is via mail. We hear from lots of folks who are in prison, mostly from trans women of color, asking for support. A lot of times they'll be in male prison facilities and are looking to get transferred to a women's facility. That's the most common issue. Unfortunately, a majority of the people that we hear from are not from New England. They're almost always from the South. A lot of folks from Texas, a lot from Alabama, Florida. And so those are really heartbreaking letters to read because often we can't offer them a ton of support. We can only send them, you know, like an encouraging letter and other resources that are in their area. But we do always respond and try to give as many resources as we can. We heard from 128 people regarding family law matters. After the Dobbs decision, last June, we heard from many, many families who are concerned that their rights as queer families and parents might be revoked, or that marriage equality might be revoked in the future. And so we heard from an overwhelming amount of LGBTQ families that were looking to know what they could do to protect their families. We heard from 116 people who experienced violence and harassment, 83 folks with transgender legal concerns, 75 intakes involved schools and teachers. This year, because of bans or proposed bans on talking about LGBTQ people and subjects in schools, we heard from many, many teachers and administrators who were concerned about what they could talk about at school, what they might be fired or lose their teaching license for talking about, things like that. And we also heard from a lot of school administrators and teachers who wanted to make sure that they were able to use students' preferred pronouns and names without outing them and disclosing gender identity pronouns, things like that, to parents, and whether or not that was something they could legally do. And we also, on the other side, heard from a lot of parents who were concerned that schools were not adequately equipped to support their LGBTQ kid. We heard from 67 folks in the area of employment and 65 in medical care and access. We also have many other topic areas that we hear from people, but these were kind of the biggest ones in 2022. Recent work in Massachusetts. So an example of the work that we are doing, on June 27th of this year, GLAAD filed a friend of the court brief in the First Circuit Court of Appeals on behalf of the Massachusetts Superintendents Association in support of Ludlow Public Schools. This particular case, which is Foote versus Town of Ludlow, involved actions taken by teachers and staff to support the well-being of 2 students, including using the students' requested names and pronouns, and waiting to discuss their gender expression at school with parents until the students themselves were ready to do so. Because the schools affirmed and supported the students in this way, they were meeting their obligation to provide a safe and equal educational environment for all students. Years of research show that LGBTQ+ supportive school policies create better outcomes for all students. But the parents did not like that this was happening, and that's why they chose to sue the town. The school district's motion to dismiss the parents' case was argued before the U.S. District Court in Springfield on October 17th of last year. They dismissed the parents' case, and that ruling is now on appeal at the U.S. Court of Appeals for the First Circuit. So the parents are still trying to see if they can get this lawsuit further. You can find more information on our website. I'm happy to share the link once I'm no longer sharing my screen and presenting. Other recent work is on the MPA, which is the Massachusetts Parentage Act, which is looking to affirm and protect families, ensuring that all children can access the security of legal parentage. Essentially, in Massachusetts, we're the only New England state where same-sex families, queer and trans families, where both parents are not biologically related to the child, essentially, have to go through a lengthy second parent adoption process to have a legal connection to their child. And we're trying to update that so that it's a more streamlined process and allows family that legal relationship that really protects children. So there's many paths to parenthood and many types of families in Massachusetts, but our statutes have not kept pace with modern science and the diversity of our families, which leaves children vulnerable. An act to ensure legal parentage equality, known as the MPA, updates Massachusetts statutes to clarify who could be a parent and how to establish parentage. This bill is critical to ensuring that all children can access the security of legal parentage, regardless of the circumstances of their birth. It is based on the Uniform Parentage Act, which serves as a uniform framework for ensuring the protection of the relationship between parents and children, which was originally passed in 1973 to protect children born to unmarried people. And it was most recently revised and approved in 2017. and several neighboring states, including Vermont and Maine, have passed similar parentage legislation. This as well is on our website. So this is some of the most recent work we've done in Massachusetts, although we're working all over New England and really at this moment all over the country. A big amount of our focus right now is on protecting and advocating for trans youth. So we have a few different cases pending in Alabama and Florida in regards to transgender health bans. And right now we have an injunction in both states. So we're really working kind of all across the board right now, but because this meeting is specific to Massachusetts, this is some of our most recent work here. So here's my contact information. The best way to get in touch with me is really email. I will also put my email in the chat after this so that you have it there. And I am happy to answer any questions or pass it off to other folks and then answer questions at the end.
Gabrielle, can you talk a little bit about the legal of attorneys and network and how that works if a person was to call the hotline or to get a referral? Is it nonprofit agencies? Is it firms? Like how does GLAAD sustain that type of network where you're not only in New England, but maybe across the country?
Sure. So folks call GLAAD. We do an initial intake, getting kind of as much information as we can about what they're experiencing to see whether or not we're able to offer direct support with the attorneys that work at GLAAD specifically. We do support a very large amount of folks annually, but also because our focus is impact litigation, so think like really big overarching cases. For example, we were the folks, like some of the folks involved in getting marriage equality passed in all 50 states. So things like that, kind of larger arching issues are what we generally take on. If there's laws in place that already protect people, so for example, not that we never take on employment cases because we are working on right now, but like generally like employment discrimination, that's not something that we typically work with if there's already laws in place to protect people, right? And so we do refer out to other attorneys. We have a lawyer referral service for attorneys who have signed up to be a part of that service, who identify as being queer and trans friendly, being knowledgeable about the HIV community. Those folks, typically people do pay to work with, although they do offer pro bono and prorated services depending on the situation. We also do have relationships with different like legal services in each New England state that are free or low cost for depending on like, there's different, I can't think of the word that I want. They have different metrics for kind of who they're able to help. So sometimes it's based on low income or other demographics and things like that. But we do refer out if that's what people are looking for. We also, nationally, we do work with a couple of other partner organizations like Lambda Legal and NCLR who do LGBTQ advocacy work nationally. We sometimes refer folks to ACLU, depending on like where they're located. So, you know, the ACLU of whatever state. But in terms of attorney referrals for specific attorneys, we only have that information for New England because that's where our focus is.
Other questions for Gabrielle?
And like I said, I will put my email in the chat. So if anything comes up or you have any concerns, please feel more than free to reach out to me directly.
All right. Thank you so much, Gabrielle. Thank you. All right. We're going to turn to Sarah. Sarah Moore, who uses she and her, is the anti-LGBTQ+ extremist analysis for ADL and GLAAD, focused on countering what we talked about, really, the anti-LGBTQ+ extremism and hate. She recently received her master's degree in security studies from Georgetown University, congratulations, and received a bachelor's degree in psychology, sociology, and comparative religion from Miami University in 2020. She previously worked as a general associate at the University of Maryland's START Globalism Terrorism Database, and as a graduate research assistant at Georgetown. She's worked with the Bellingcats Global Authentication Project and the Prosecution Project. And for those of you who aren't incredibly familiar with ADL, which has been a great partner to us as well, ADL continues to be at the cutting edge of really fighting bigotry and racism. And it's recently announced a partnership with GLAAD. GLAAD is the nonprofit organization, as we mentioned, focused on LGBTQ+ advocacy and cultural change. And that partnership, I think, is going to bring an incredible, it greatly increase the impact of both organizations in this area. So Sarah, we're really happy to have you here this morning.
Thank you so much. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen here. Okay. So, hi everybody. As Marian noted, my name is Sarah Moore, and I'm the anti-LGBTQ+ extremism analyst for both ADL and GLAAD. Just as a side note, this GLAAD is slightly different than Gabrielle's GLAAD. This is GLAAD, G-L-A-A-D, which focuses more on the media advocacy side. So that is kind of what our partnership has entailed between ADL and GLAAD. So for my presentation today, I'm going to be talking about trends in anti-LGBTQ+ hate and extremism, with the goal of kind of contextualizing how these trends have played out in terms of anti-LGBTQ+ incidents in Massachusetts specifically. So just a couple things up front. I'm going to cover a lot of ground here, so I'm happy to answer any questions afterwards. And also I want to note that some of these topics do have some disturbing language and imagery attached to them. So if you need to like step away from your screen, turn your camera off, whatever it might be, please feel free to do so. So what I'll be kind of covering here today is first taking a look at how ADL and GLAAD are defining anti-LGBTQ+ extremism. Then take a look at 3 core narratives that really drive this ecosystem of hate. Then taking a look at some of the key players that are involved in spreading many of these narratives and then enacting the real world harm that we're seeing. And then finally, in terms of real world harm, looking at a recent report that ADL and GLAAD just put out covering anti-LGBTQ+ incidents in the US. So first up is our definition. When we're talking about anti-LGBTQ+ extremism, I do find it helpful sometimes to start out by saying what we mean when we say LGBTQ+. So this refers to folks who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer or questioning, or have another non-straight or non-cisgender identity. In terms of anti-LGBTQ+ extremism, this is a form of single issue extremism whose adherents are focused on demonizing, attacking, or otherwise targeting people, communities, or institutions that fall under that LGBTQ+ umbrella, or that they perceive to fall under that umbrella. While we are calling this a form of single issue extremism, we do know that it can often overlap with many other hateful ideologies. As part of our new report, we actually took a look at an overlap between racism and anti-Semitism in terms of the tropes that are being discussed when folks are perpetrating some of these incidents. So we do know that folks with intersecting marginalized identities are often on the receiving end of many of these forms of hate. Next up, we'll take a look at some of the core narratives. The reason I started out by talking about narratives is because unlike other forms of hate where you could maybe point to a central group that's driving a lot of this discussion, instead the kind of unifying factor here for anti-LGBTQ+ hate and extremism are these shared tropes or stories that are spread across this ecosystem and unify disparate groups and movements. Each of these different narratives have elements that have been sensationalized, cherry-picked, or taken out of context, all for the ideologically motivated goal of demonizing the LGBTQ+ community. These narratives often overlap, but for the purposes of today's presentation, we're going to break these down into just 3 to take a look. So first up, we're going to talk about this conversation around grooming or pedophilia. So when I talk about these narratives, I oftentimes find it helpful to first start off by saying, what is kind of the legitimate usage of these terms and how are they actually impacting folks? And then how are these terms being misappropriated and used to target the LGBTQ+ community? In terms of grooming, we can look at RAINN, which is the nation's largest anti-sexual violence organization, who defines grooming as manipulative behaviors used by sexual abusers to gain access to a potential victim, coerce them to agree to the abuse, and reduce the risk of being caught. We know that sexual abuse, including grooming behaviors, are a very, very real and present danger to young children in this country. That being said, the ways in which grooming has been applied to the LGBTQ+ community is patently false. This narrative is not using this definition of grooming legitimately. Instead, it's implicitly or explicitly claiming that LGBTQ+ adults are somehow pedophiles who are preying on children just because they're doing things like discussing issues related to sexual orientation and gender identity, or by displaying their own gender identity or sexual orientation in the presence of children. Examples that have been called grooming or pedophilia have included teaching about gender fluidity in schools, showing a queer couple kissing on television, or even having a trans person outwardly express their gender identity through clothing or makeup. Even though these actions are in no way related to or inviting of the sexual abuse of minors, anti-LGBTQ+ extremists are using the terms groomers and pedophiles as slurs for the LGBTQ+ community writ large. Another somewhat related narrative that we've been seeing has touched upon these false allegations in terms of gender affirming care. So again, we'll start out by looking at what gender affirming care actually is. The Department of Health and Human Services defines gender affirming care as a supportive form of healthcare that consists of an array of services, which may include medical, surgical, mental health, and non-medical services for trans and non-binary people. You might have heard of gender affirming care in the forms of top or bottom procedures or gender reassignment surgery. But I really want to stress here that gender affirming care is actually a really broad category of healthcare that includes non-surgical and non-pharmaceutical options as well. When trans and non-binary youth have attempted to get access to this type of care, they're oftentimes met with intense pushback by anti-LGBTQ+ extremists. When we're discussing this pushback, I think it's really important to note that according to the American Academy of Pediatrics, there's a really strong consensus amongst the most prominent medical organizations worldwide that evidence-based gender affirming care for trans children and adolescents is both medically necessary and appropriate. We know that when children are not provided with this care, it can have long-lasting impacts on their mental and physical health. So for instance, GLAAD has reported that 52% of trans and non-binary youth have seriously considered suicide in the past year, and 1 in 5 have actually attempted. Numerous medical studies have shown, however, that having access to gender affirming care can significantly lower rates of depression, suicidal thoughts, and suicide attempts in youth. Despite these facts, anti-LGBTQ+ extremists sometimes allege that gender-affirming care amounts somehow to child mutilation and castration, and claims that it's causing irreparable damage to young children. Harassment campaigns and rallies, like the one pictured here by the Daily Wire's Matt Walsh, are oftentimes organized in order to demonize the parents and medical providers who are offering this health care to kids. Not only does this amplification create a really dangerous situation for the parents and medical providers who are trying to provide the best care possible for kids, but it also denies the existence of LGBTQ+ youth and results oftentimes in the removal of these services, including non-medical and non-pharmaceutical or non-surgical and non-pharmaceutical options altogether for trans and non-binary youth. Finally, the last kind of narrative that we'll touch on here is this conversation around gender ideology and claims of indoctrination. So gender ideology is a really ambiguous, decades-old conspiracy theory, which claims that LGBTQ+ and feminist-led movements are somehow seeking to destroy traditional families and conservative values by expanding the rights of women and LGBTQ+ persons. Today, this term gender ideology has been co-opted by a number of extremists who are trying to vilify the parents and educators that are teaching kids about an array of LGBTQ+ issues, including gender fluidity and pronoun usage, advocating for trans youth to be involved in sports, having appropriate restroom facilities in schools, and as we mentioned, having appropriate healthcare for LGBTQ+ persons. Examples of claims of gender ideology have included attempts to fire educators who are introducing LGBTQ+ books in their classroom and defaming the teachers who display pride flags in schools. This narrative not only falsely alleges that educators are attempting to brainwash children, but it's also implying that identifying as LGBTQ+ is a choice that somebody can be coerced into, rather than being an inherent part of who somebody is. So taken as a whole, these three narratives oftentimes seek to demonize all or part of the LGBTQ+ community and its allies, with this really insidious goal of marginalizing and oppressing LGBTQ+ persons. So now that we've talked a little bit about the narratives, I want to talk about who's actually spreading these and what is the impact of the spread of these. So when we're talking about the key players here, we can first start out by talking about what we're kind of terming online amplifiers. These are media personalities who oftentimes peddle these anti-LGBTQ+ narratives to their large followings online. Amplifiers often use several different types of mediums to get their points across. This could be social media, as in the form of Libs of TikTok or Gays Against Groomers, which are both up here. It could be on television with folks like Tucker Carlson or reporters at Blaze TV. It could be in the form of podcasts like Matt Walsh and the Daily Wire. And I do want to stress here that much of what these folks are saying is protected free speech. But when this speech crosses over into defamation, incitement to violence, and hate speech, that's when we at ADL and GLAAD work with social media companies to assess if that speech violates their terms of service and would warrant being removed from the platform. Regardless of the legality of their speech, these folks are still a crucial part of the anti-LGBTQ+ extremist ecosystem. The narratives that they're spreading are being picked up by bad actors and cited in their attacks against LGBTQ+ persons, which we'll cover a bit later on. These accounts are also vital to the mainstreaming of anti-LGBTQ+ hate and can oftentimes radicalize members of the general public who may not have been otherwise exposed to some of these narratives. So in terms of extremist groups that are involved in perpetrating some of these acts, we can see that events that are organized oftentimes by the online amplifiers or local grassroots movements often inevitably attract members of extremist groups as well, who amongst having other hateful and violent ideologies also are extremely active in anti-LGBTQ+ activities. The Proud Boys, which is here in the center on the bottom, are probably the most, influential anti-LGBTQ+ extremist group. They have chapters all across the country, and they oftentimes show up at drag shows to protest and will get into brawls or use armed intimidation to scare the attendees and the counter-protesters. We've also seen other local neo-Nazi groups get involved, like Aryan Freedom Network, which is up here on the top right, and the National Socialist Movement, which is there in the middle on the top. They will oftentimes show up at LGBTQ+ events. They will have their swastika adorned flags, and they oftentimes are making Nazi salutes or chanting other phrases associated with Nazism at passerbys. We've also seen extremist groups like Goyim Defense League up here on the top left, who will tie in anti-Semitism to their anti-LGBTQ+ activities. They are extremely active in flyering residential neighborhoods with threats and disinformation surrounding prominent LGBTQ+ Jews. Overall, these groups engage in many of the anti-LGBTQ+ protests, rallies, and propaganda campaigns that are held throughout the US. So now I'm going to kind of switch into looking at how these activities are actually playing out on the ground and taking a look at some of the numbers from our new report. So in terms of the anti-LGBTQ plus narratives that we've examined so far, these narratives are not harmless, and they're not confined to kind of the vacuum of the internet, which a lot of folks argue that they do. But they've instead actually inspired real-world acts of harassment, threats, vandalism, and even tragic acts of violence. So as part of this new report, we have attempted to quantify the real-world harm against the LGBTQ plus community. We launched this report back in June, focusing on anti-LGBTQ plus incidents nationwide. From June 22 to April 23, we found that there were over 356 anti-LGBTQ plus incidents in 46 US states. I want to stress here too that we fully expect that number to be way lower than what the number actually is, for a number of reasons regarding reporting and being able to actually identify where all these incidents are taking place. But these are the ones that were made available to us in our research. When we're talking about anti-LGBTQ plus incidents, we're talking about a case of harassment, vandalism, or assault, where it could be reasonably interpreted that the perpetrator was motivated by anti-LGBTQ plus hate, or that the victim was targeted due to a real or perceived LGBTQ plus identity. Breaking this down a bit further, we found over 305 incidents of harassment, 40 incidents of vandalism, and 11 cases of assault. I'll go into a bit more detail in the following slides, but in general, harassment includes cases of verbal threats, bomb threats, swatting calls, protests with the intent to harass, and real-world propaganda distribution. Vandalism includes cases of graffiti, theft, property damage, arson, so on. And finally, assault includes cases of somebody being beat, hit, shot at, or otherwise the perpetrator attempting to cause physical harm against a person. Predictably, we've seen these anti-LGBTQ plus incidents surging around Pride Month. So in our report, we found that there were 48 anti-LGBTQ plus incidents during June 22. And this was 13% of all of our overall incidents in just 1 month, and was the month with the highest number of incidents in our entire data set. Some notable cases from Pride 22 included death threats against educators in Wisconsin over a Title IX case involving misgendering. There were bomb threats against a California state senator who's openly gay. We saw a number of anti-LGBTQ plus, anti-Semitic, and racist flyers being distributed by groups like GDL and the KKK. And probably most notably, we saw the arrest of 31 individuals associated with the white supremacist group Patriot Front in Idaho for conspiracy to riot at a Pride festival. Pride 2023 has been no exception. We've seen a huge spike in anti-LGBTQ plus incidents over the last 4 weeks. We actually just put out a new blog on this on GLAAD's site looking at just Pride 2023, but we actually found that there were over 145 incidents nationwide, which is more than 3 times the numbers that we documented during Pride 22. These incidents included cases like mass protests at school board meetings, where there's been repeated violence between protesters and counter-protesters. We saw bomb threats against Target stores and Anheuser-Busch factories for their Pride collections and ad campaigns with LGBTQ plus influencers. We also saw violent anti-gay assaults in New York and Texas, including the tragic death of an LGBTQ plus woman in Cedar Park, Texas. Going back to our discussion of extremists in this space, we found that approximately half of all incidents were conducted by individuals associated with extremist groups. Incidents that most frequently involved members of far-right groups like the Proud Boys, white supremacist groups like Patriot Front and White Lives Matter, anti-Semitic groups like Goyim Defense League, neo-Nazi groups like Aryan Freedom Network, and anti-LGBTQ plus extremist groups like Gays Against Groomers. In terms of who was being targeted in these incidents, we found that drag shows, drag performers, and venues were oftentimes the most frequent targets of anti-LGBTQ+ incidents, with 138 incidents total, followed by schools, colleges, and educators at 33 incidents, healthcare facilities and providers at 23 incidents, and government buildings and officials at 22 incidents. Breaking that down a bit more, first we'll look at some of those drag-related incidents. As I mentioned, we saw 138 of these, and these have included at least 92 protests, 7 acts of vandalism, 5 bomb threats, and 4 instances of anti-LGBTQ+ assaults. You can see some of these examples here. So on the left, we have an individual who firebombed a donut store in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the night before a drag show. In the middle was a flyer reported to ADL, actually from Massachusetts, by a constituent, which contains an explicit death threat against drag queens that was found on a public utility box. And on the right, we saw individuals protesting an all-age drag show, calling the event an act of child abuse. As you can see in many of these cases, the perpetrators are citing these narratives around grooming and pedophilia during the actual incidents. In terms of incidents relating to healthcare, as I mentioned, we saw 23 of these in the last 11 months. And these include at least 9 protests, 9 cases of violent threats, and 3 separate bomb threats. You can see some of these incidents listed here, including the spree of bomb threats targeting Boston Children's Hospital in the months following the release of an investigation into the hospital by Libs of TikTok. Beyond bomb threats and death threats, these hospitals and healthcare providers often face constant harassment on their social media accounts and have their private information released online or are doxxed. Those perpetrating these incidents, again, often cite these claims around gender-affirming care that we've previously discussed, claiming that they're trying to save children from being mutilated or castrated. In terms of education-related incidents, we saw 33 of these in the last 11 months. And these have included cases of at least 10 different protests, 10 cases of verbal harassment, 4 bomb threats or swatting calls, and 6 cases of graffiti. You can see a couple of these examples here, including the bomb threats I mentioned against a middle school in Wisconsin after a Title IX case relating to misgendering a student. In another case, a school in Chicago received a bomb threat days after its dean was featured on Project Veritas for offering an LGBTQ inclusive sex education class to its students. And there was another one in Southwest Florida here that was swatted after it was featured on Libs of TikTok. Perpetrators of these incidents often cite these themes from the gender ideology narrative, including claiming that teachers are somehow indoctrinating their students as a justification for these attacks. And then finally, nearly half of all of our incidents targeting the LGBTQ+ community were specifically looking at LGBTQ+ establishments or symbols of the community like pride flags. Many of these examples include attacks against LGBTQ+ nightclubs and bars, with folks writing anti-gay slurs on the walls or taking a bat to the windows, as in the example on the bottom left here. Most tragically, we've also seen perpetrators enacting violence at these establishments, as in the case of Club Q, where a gunman walked into the nightclub and killed 5 patrons and injured at least 19 others. So I'm going to kind of wrap up here by just looking at the geographic scale of some of these incidents. Our report documented cases of harassment, vandalism, and assault nationwide, with cases in 46 states and the District of Columbia. States with the most cases included California with 42 incidents, New York with 35, Texas with 30, and Florida with 27. In terms of Massachusetts in particular, this is a screen grab from ADL's Hate, Anti-Semitism, Terrorism, and Extremism, or HEAT map, which shows a breakdown of our data by state. And so I pulled up Massachusetts here to do a little bit of a deeper look. And some of these cases have included events like individuals associated with the white supremacist National Socialist Club and the far-right Proud Boys targeting a drag queen story hour in Taunton, Massachusetts, where they claimed that the drag queens are pedophiles. We saw the theft and subsequent arson of a pride flag and a transgender pride flag from a private residence in Westfield, Massachusetts. We saw death threats being sent to a doctor affiliated with the National LGBTQIA+ Health Education Center in Boston, Massachusetts. We saw that flyer that I mentioned earlier calling for death to drag queens in Somerville, Massachusetts. And probably, as I mentioned before, the most well-known would be the repeated bomb threats called into Boston Children's Hospital, targeting its gender-affirming care services after the Libs of TikTok article on the hospital. So as you can see here, we can talk about this kind of hate and extremism broadly, but there's oftentimes a localized version of the same stories that are playing out on that national stage. I hope that you take away from this presentation that anti-LGBTQ+ narratives don't exist in a vacuum, and instead are consistently inspiring real-world acts of harassment, vandalism, and assault, oftentimes with a criminal nexus. As you begin to confront these cases of anti-LGBTQ+ hate in your work, I hope that this helps to kind of contextualize the incidents and make sense of the trends at play in local events. With that, I will go ahead and stop sharing my screen and open it up to any questions.
Thank you, Sarah. Questions for Sarah?
Sarah, is there any studies or information with the collaborations that ADL is doing with different organizations of just like, is what you were just talking about, how it is impacting just the everyday communities, neighborhoods, and interactions with people? Is that something that might come out of this partnership or in other collaborations that ADL has?
So when you're asking, like, how is this impacting folks, do you mean like in terms of feelings about like the
or just some data collection that says, like you were just saying, these events, although they're happening on, we're hearing about them on this broader scale, they also impact our day-to-day lives in our communities and so forth. So I'm always wondering if we ever capture that data of what people are seeing or hearing, how are they internalizing that in their just everyday lives?
Yeah, so our Center for Technology and Society at ADL do a report every year looking at online hate and harassment, which kind of gets to that point, I think, in that they are looking at how different communities are feeling about their safety in online spaces, which I think oftentimes reflects a lot of these national trends. So for instance, they just did one oversampling for trans respondents that they released in June. And they found that something like at least 50% of trans respondents reported feeling unsafe online. So I think like you can use some of those to kind of get a sense for what folks are facing at the national level. But I don't know if there's one kind of specifically localized to different communities.
Other questions, comments? I think one of the things that was very noticeable is when you started talking about the number of incidents, I mean, obviously any of them are too many, but the highest numbers are in places like California and New York, which we don't think of as sort of bastions of conservative thought. What do you think about that? Is it just sort of a social media, people picking up on that kind of thing? You know, that was surprising to me.
Yeah, so one thing I'll note with that number is that California, New York, Texas, and Florida are the states with the highest populations in the US. And so you would expect to see also the highest number of incidents in those states as a result of that. But I do think that, you know, showing that kind of geographic spread of this, there are incidents in states that we'd consider to be blue states or states that may be considered to be more progressive. California in particular has seen a really big increase in terms of protests at school boards over LGBTQ+ issues in schools. So for example, right now there's a big contingency of the Armenian American population that are arguing against some of the LGBTQ inclusive policies that have been put into place in some of the school districts there. And so there's a lot of grassroots organizing around that in terms of like the kind of cultural aspect. And similarly for Maryland, we've seen a lot of the Muslim community members there actually organizing similarly on religious grounds against LGBTQ+ policies in schools. So, you know, it can happen in any of the states that we're seeing. There is unfortunately a nationwide scope to many of these incidents.
Right. Questions, comments? Let me just check the chat. All right. Sarah, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you all for sharing that information in the chat.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you. All right, other community things we should know about, things people are doing, things that are going on. Anybody, anything to share? All right, well, thank you everybody for joining us this morning. Thank you again to our presenters. We will see you for our next meeting on August 10th at 10. So until then, stay safe. Thank you.
Sarah. Thank
Bye.
you.
Thanks, Mary.
Bye-bye.